Well, welcome to our class. This is a busy week for a lot of our folks at church because it's camp week. And while we're in the midst of continuing our study of the book of Genesis, the last half of Genesis, a lot of our young people and our older ones are all at camp, and we hope things are going well for them there. Tonight, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 41. You'll notice how we've kind of dealt with every other chapter because we don't have enough time to take all of these events in Joseph's life. And so we've tried to pick out some key ones to tie his story together. But the nearer we get to the end of the book of Genesis, the richer the story of Joseph becomes. We began his story when he was 17 years old. We see him tonight at age 30. It's amazing what can happen in 13 years. Don't you wish Joseph had kept a diary, a journal, had written down his own reaction to all the things that happened to him? A lot can happen to a person between the ages of 17 and 30. Those of us who are well beyond 30 can think back to, that was a busy period. We were involved in lots of activities, lots of opportunities, lots of planning and preparation as we looked ahead to a life of maturity. Any number of mistakes can also accumulate. Pride, immaturity, boasting, even bullying. Somehow those things seem to rise to the surface between those ages of 17 and 30. For Joseph, it's been an interesting set of experiences. He's found a new environment. He has developed what we would call marketable skills. He's become an able administrator. He's enjoyed promotions. He's also endured humiliation and disgrace, as can happen to lots of people, even suffering in prison. In the time between last week's lesson and the one for tonight, we have Joseph's experience, notably with the king's butler and baker. Both men had puzzling dreams, just as Joseph earlier had two dreams. And just as a little bit later, Pharaoh will have two dreams. This double dream motif runs through the story of Joseph in a very interesting fashion. Well, Joseph is able to explain their dreams, that is, the baker and the butler. In essence, he gives them what you and I would call good news and bad news. For the butler, the news was good. Restoration. He was going to be restored to his position at court and regain his position, and life would go on. To the baker, the news was bad. He would be executed. His life would end. He would be punished for his offense. As Joseph told these explanations of the dreams, and he talked about that butler being restored to his post, he said to the butler, "I have one request of you. When you get back to court, remember me. Remember me." That's a phrase we pick up often in the Bible because it says what has happened is critical, meaningful, significant. Don't forget it. The Apostle Peter, in his 2 letters, repeatedly reminds his readers that he is helping them remember. He's reminding them of things lest they forget. An English poet honoring the long-term experience of Queen Victoria wrote in his poem, "Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget." Joseph said, "Please remember me." But as so often happens, good intentions are easily forgotten. And when the butler returned to his position, he forgot. And life went on. Joseph remained in prison. But in time, Pharaoh had 2 very puzzling dreams. And when he appealed to all of his court and no one could offer him a reasonable explanation, suddenly the butler remembered, there was a man in prison with me. He was a Hebrew. He explained my dream. You ought to appeal to him. He finally remembered Joseph. And Pharaoh immediately sent for him. And Joseph offered his explanation. Pharaoh had dreamed about 7 cows and 7 ears of corn. And Joseph explained they meant 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And he advised Pharaoh, you need to find a wise and intelligent man to oversee those 14 years. It's going to be a difficult time. You're going to go through years when there is plenty, and the temptation is going to be to waste it. And they're going to be followed by 7 years of great need and want, and somebody needs to be sure that those needs are met. Joseph even mapped out a strategy. This is how we can do it. And this is where our lesson for tonight begins. Joseph's appointment. Genesis chapter 41, picking up with verse 37. And it's a great beginning. So the advice was good. You couldn't argue with that. The advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. It was sound. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this? A man in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephnaah-Paneah. And he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, the priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Well, we have to assume that Pharaoh was at least astute enough to recognize wisdom when he heard it. And as Joseph spelled out the strategy that he recommended to deal with these years of plenty and years of want, he determined that the advice was good. And he and his court saw Joseph was just the man they needed. Do you notice that Pharaoh credited God with the wisdom Joseph showed? In verses 38 to 39, he identifies God twice as the inspiration for Joseph's advice. This was not just natural intuitiveness. This was not just native intelligence. Joseph learned this somewhere. Someone was guiding him. And the someone, Pharaoh believed, was God. And so he appointed Joseph to take charge of all of his possessions all over the land of Egypt. It's a little bit like what happened with Potiphar, except that time Joseph was over a house and over fields. Now he's over a land. His promotion is exceedingly great. But we're told that Joseph is not going to be some puppet with Pharaoh pulling the strings. He not only gives Joseph the authority, he gives him the recognition of that authority, the symbols. He gives Joseph his signet ring that's used to authorize the laws. He gave him his garments of fine linen. And once again, clothes make the man for Joseph. It's interesting to see how often we connect clothing with Joseph. And then he gave him a gold chain that was a sign of his authority. When you saw that, you knew this man had the right to speak as he spoke. And finally, he gave him his own chariot, Joseph's own chariot, that would run directly behind that of Pharaoh. We would say he was second in command in all the land. The public was told to give him the appropriate honor and respect that he deserved. They were to bow before him, just as they bowed before Pharaoh. The power given to Joseph is exceptional. Number one, he's a Hebrew slave, and now he's over the land of Egypt. We think of all that we're going to know in the coming months as we read Genesis and on into Exodus. What happened with the Hebrews in that land of Egypt? The rise and fall of the Hebrews. He is set over all the land. Only the throne is accepted from him, just as Joseph understood he handled all the house of Pharaoh, except his wife, and she would have changed that if she could. There's an interesting statement that says no one could lift a hand or a foot without Joseph's consent. Nobody came in and said, oh, I don't think we ought to do it that way. Let me tell you a better way to do this. Everybody listened to Joseph's advice because it was sound. It was to be respected. To make Joseph even more acceptable to the people, Pharaoh gave him an Egyptian name. After all, if he's going to tour the country and he's going to meet with people, he needs to sound like an Egyptian. He gave him an Egyptian wife that says he's now acclimated himself to our culture. He's a part of us. She was the daughter of an Egyptian priest, which elevated her in the eyes of the people. And then that passage ends with Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. He toured the country. He did not sit in the city and hand down rules for governing all the people. We see this when we inaugurate a new president in our country. One of the first things he does is take a tour of the country. He needs to go to the places where he received a lot of support, and he needs to go to the places where he didn't get much support. He's got to know the people, or they have to know him. And here's this stranger, this Hebrew, former slave, but now with an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife and all the trappings of his office, he's ready to tour the country and see what needs to be done. He's prepared to implement his plan for plenty, which is the next section of our lesson, picking up at verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the field which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, when Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. In his travels, he learned where the centers of population were. He learned the local leadership. And he began to look for places where they could appropriately store food. And he gave it all a sense of local control. He built storehouses in every major city, and he stored in those storehouses the grain from the fields that surrounded each city. People bought into the ownership of this. This is our grain. It's in our storehouse. Joseph made them identify with their possession. And then the 7 years of plenty began. Oh, that first year may not have been all that exceptional. It was a good year with a good crop, but they were accustomed to having good years occasionally when the river Nile overflowed its banks and flooded the land with fresh water and with good fertilizer. But then a second year came, and it was good too. And a third year, and it was even better. And a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and it seemed like we have just been overwhelmingly blessed. But each year, Joseph was very careful to put away that food. He knew that if he didn't control this, likely a lot of that would be wasted. We had more than we could use, and so we didn't worry about saving any of it. We just let it go to waste. Joseph knew the need was coming. The people might not know that, but Joseph did. And as they acquired more and more bounty, Joseph's plan called for those storehouses in every city, with an administrator overseeing each warehouse, to make sure it was properly collected, maintained, and sealed up. He even required that the people pay a 20% tax on everything they collected. Not in money, but in grain. They had to give 20% of it to the government to make sure it was going to be held in reserve. That bounty was so great that the text uses the old familiar simile, it was as the sand of the sea. It was uncountable. It was immeasurable. How much do we have? I don't know. It's like looking at the sand on the seashore. As the crops produced, so did Joseph's family. And he and his wife have 2 sons. For all of his Egyptian trappings, his Egyptian name, his Egyptian wife, his Egyptian position, do you notice how Joseph names his sons? He chose names for his sons that honored God, not Egypt, not the God that his father-in-law was a priest for. He named Manasseh a name that says, God made me forget. He had a lot of things he would like to forget. The way he had suffered, the way he had been mistreated, the way he had been abused. And Ephraim means, God made me fruitful. God made me forget. He took away the bad things. God made me fruitful, an appropriate name for all this bountiful harvest they're enjoying. We are fruitful. I'm fruitful. God has been good to us. Joseph never forgot his suffering back home, and he continued to remember the fruitfulness he had enjoyed in what the Bible calls the land of his affliction. For all that was going well, remember, Joseph is still far from home, far from his father, far from his brothers. He is in a land of pagan worship, not among the Hebrews. He's trying to maintain his Hebrew character and nature in a land that's totally foreign to all that he wants to be. And then we turn to our third section of the text, Joseph's plan for the famine, picking up at verse 53. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in all of the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread, and Pharaoh said, go to Joseph. Whatever he says to you, do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Just as suddenly as the plenty began, just that suddenly the 7 years of famine began. 1 year the Nile did not overflow, sending water and fertilizer over the fields. The crops died soon after they were planted, and 1 year followed another, and another, and another. And suddenly those 7 years of bounty are eclipsed by 7 years of famine, of lack. The famine spread all over the land of Egypt. But even the Egyptians could be said to have bread because of all that grain they had stored. They were not prepared to starve. The people cried out to Pharaoh for help, just as we expect our leaders to solve all problems. And Pharaoh wonderfully is able to say, go to Joseph. Whatever he tells you, do. I don't know if you thought about it, but that phrase is rather interesting because it reflects exactly what Mary said to the servants in Cana of Galilee when Jesus was asked to supply the wine that had run out. And she says to the servants, fill the water pots. Or says to the servants, whatever he tells you to do, do it. And Jesus said, fill the water pots. Well, Pharaoh is saying to these people, whatever Joseph tells you to do, you do it. And so Joseph made provision to sort out the food supply. It's what I would call Operation Breadbasket. What are we going to do? Well, you'll notice in the first place, they did not give away the grain. This was no government giveaway. People had to buy it. After all, they'd had 7 years of bounty. They'd done well. They'd stored up a lot. And Joseph said, you'll pay for this grain. And by so doing, the people were blessed, and the bounty of the country, the treasury of the country was enriched. The people were blessed in many ways and finally acquired sufficient wealth to cover their needs. And by this method, Joseph provided for the people and enriched the treasury of Egypt. Soon it wasn't long before other countries suffering the famine sent representatives to buy grain from Egypt. As we well know, that's exactly how Joseph's brothers came to Egypt. They learned there was food available in Egypt, and their father Jacob said, you need to go down there and buy some. Money was not the problem. Food was the problem. And so provision was made for them to make that journey. As we watch these things unfold in the life of Joseph, we see him each time moving up a little farther, a little farther, a little farther, till now he's over the whole land. And everybody in Egypt is subject to his direction and guidance. One man is prepared to save the nation of Egypt, always by the guidance of God. And again, we're impressed with the use of the Lord all the way through here. Let me suggest some things that I hope will be meaningful out of this lesson. Joseph never lost sight of God. He must have felt a great deal as Mordecai felt and explained to Esther when he said to her, who knows but that you were raised up for such a time as this? Did Joseph consider that reality? Who knows but that God put me here for just such a time as this? I can't ignore it. I can't deny it. I'm here and I need to do what I can do. Use my hands and use my brain and use my abilities. It's the kind of thing we need to ask ourselves. Who knows but that I was put here for just such a time as this? And not decide I can't do anything. Edward Rowland Sill has a poem called Opportunity, in which he describes a young man going out to the battlefield with a sword, and it was not a very good sword, and it broke, and he buried the hilt in the sand and slunk off the field. The king's son came along without a weapon. It had been taken away from him, saw the broken sword in the sand, pulled it out, and with it saved an army that day. Opportunity. Do I seize it or do I ignore it? Joseph seized the opportunity. Number two, Joseph illustrates the power of a godly influence, an influence that touched the lives of others just as he touched Potiphar and the jailer and the Pharaoh. Each time the person who was theoretically over Joseph is blessed by his very presence. Number three, what an impact Joseph had on the nation of Egypt and some of their neighboring nations with the grain that was stored and saved to meet the time of need. The story of Joseph is going to continue for generations in the land of Egypt until finally the day will come when a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. It took a long time, but finally the time came when who was Joseph? I never heard of him. What did he do? A Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And that's when Moses and the children of Israel began having trouble with Pharaoh. The right man in the right place at the right time can make a big difference. A little bit later in Genesis, as we go to the end of the book, we'll read about his reunion with Jacob, his father, who had lived far too many years, believing Joseph, his favorite son, was dead. They are reunited. And the book of Genesis ends with Joseph begging, when I die, don't bury me in Egypt. Take my bones back to my land and bury me with my people. I need to say a few things as we wrap up tonight's lesson. This is our final lesson for Wednesday nights. The elders have decided that we will resume our normal pre-pandemic Wednesday format. We'll begin our meals again on June the 23rd. That's next Wednesday night. and kick off that night our 2021 summer series. The elders have already announced our group of speakers for that series. The first is J.P. Conway, the preacher for the Ackland Avenue Church. I look forward to our return to this format on our Wednesdays. Many of us look forward to being able to eat together. On a personal note, I want to thank you for being part of this class and for the many kind words of support that I have received over the months. Because we're ending with lesson 9, you have 4 more lessons in your book, which I hope you'll complete. I hope you'll continue with the story of Joseph until that final accounting at the end of Genesis. That way you can conclude this long and eventful story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, these great patriarchs whose names will appear over and over again throughout the rest of the Bible. Because what God did with these men is going to prefigure what he's going to do with countless others as his story unfolds. And so as we wrap up tonight and we wrap up this series, I could think of nothing better to do than to use the words of the television personality Carol Burnett, who always liked to end her show with, "I'm so glad we've had this time together." I'm glad you and I have had this time together. Thank you, and God bless.